In the freezing shadows of Arizona's wild hills, a blind Mustang named Briar walks alone, guided not by sight, but by memory. Every step echoes a question no one can answer. Where is my family? Abandoned by the herd he once called home, hunted by wolves, and battered by storms, he should have given up. But somehow he didn't, because deep inside that broken body, a flicker of hope still burned. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. The wind howled through the dense pines of Coconino Forest like a chorus of lost voices. High above, storm clouds still loomed after days of relentless snow and sleet, casting a leaden pall over the land. It was early March in Flagstaff, Arizona, a city cradled in the shadow of the San Francisco peaks, where winter overstayed its welcome and the forests held secrets beneath their frost-bitten floor. Amid the icy hush, a lone figure moved with fragile determination, hooves crunching softly against the brittle undergrowth. His name was Briar, a Mustang stallion of uncommon grace, even now as he wandered sightless through the underbrush. Briar was once known among the herds for his deep chestnut coat that gleamed gold at sunset, a proud blaze of white streaking down his nose, and a spirit that could not be tamed. He had been 5 winters old when tragedy struck. Still young but already strong, the kind of horse others followed without needing to be asked. But now that proud gleam was gone. His eyes, once keen and alert, were clouded with milky blindness. A freak storm, ice and thunder tangled together, had sent a shattered limb from an old pine crashing down. It hadn't crushed him, but it had taken his sight. Each step now was a test of faith. The forest had grown strange. Its scents were familiar but far away, and its sounds, a snapping twig, a shifting branch, were sharp with threat. His gait was stiff, hesitant. Without vision, Briar had become a creature of echoes and memory. Sometimes, in the stillness between heartbeats, he thought he could hear them, his herd, the rhythm of trusted hooves, the comforting snorts, the laughter of wind carried in their breath. But when he called out in soft whinnies, the forest offered only silence in return. The hunger came first, gnawing and sharp, but the fear came faster. Each unfamiliar sound made his muscles tense. Briar's long legs trembled beneath him as he edged around rocks and frozen brush, his ears twitching with effort. Once he would have galloped through these woods, tail streaming, snow flying from his hooves. Now, every rustle might be danger. Every step could be the last. He paused beneath a leaning juniper, nostrils flaring. Somewhere nearby, wolves had passed recently. He could smell the wet musk of them. He lowered his head and pressed his muzzle against the icy moss, grounding himself in the texture, trying to summon strength. And then came the memories. Like a film unspooling in his mind, the sun-drenched grasslands of the northern valley, running alongside Sable, his older sister, whose dark coat shimmered like wet stone. She had been the one to teach him to leap fallen logs, to bite back when challenged, to trust the herd and follow the wind. There had been Arroyo, the wiry young colt who always tripped over his own legs, and Junebug, a gentle mare who once shielded him during a monsoon with nothing but her body. They had been his world, and now they were gone. The pain of blindness was duller than it had once been, but the ache of loss remained sharp. Briar raised his head again, pointing it toward the wind as if hoping to catch a scent, a whisper, a ghost of those who had once loved him. The forest did not give. Above him, crows cawed, sharp and distant. Briar flinched. The air grew colder. Dusk was falling quickly now, painting the forest in silvers and shadows. He stumbled on a tree root and fell hard to his knees. His left front leg, the one that had borne the brunt of his earlier injury, throbbed painfully. For a moment, he lay still, his side rising and falling rapidly, steam rising from his damp coat. Then he heard it, a low, rustling sound. Not the wind, not a squirrel. He strained, ears flicking. Something was moving slowly through the snow-crusted underbrush. The scent came next. Wild, carnivorous, wolves. There were at least 3 of them. Briar didn't need sight to know they were watching him, assessing. The smell of hunger was unmistakable. A soft growl came from the side, followed by another directly behind him. The third was still circling. Briar's heart pounded. This was it. This was how the story ended. But something ancient stirred within him, something older than fear. Survival was not just instinct. It was will. He gritted his teeth and pushed himself upright. His legs shook beneath him, but they held. He lifted his head and screamed, a high, wild whinny that cut through the cold like lightning. And then he kicked. With no clear direction, he reared up on his hind legs and struck out into the darkness, hooves lashing air and snow. A yelp broke the silence. He'd made contact. One wolf cried and fell back, growling, but the others remained. Briar twisted his body, pain slicing through his side, but still he fought, snapping his teeth, swinging his head like a club. Not today, he seemed to say. Not without trying. The wolves retreated just enough to wait. They weren't giving up. They were patient. They knew time and weakness were allies, but so was memory. As the wolves slipped into the gloom, circling wider now, Briar turned and limped deeper into the trees. The night swallowed him, but he did not fall. Somewhere out there, perhaps his family still lived. Perhaps they didn't. But until his last breath, Briar would search. Because what else was love if not the courage to keep walking, even blind, towards something you may never see again? The snow began to fall again, soft and relentless, and Briar disappeared into the white. Night in the Coconino wilderness was a veil of silence and bone-deep cold, broken only by the rustle of snow-laden branches and the faint tremor of paws padding across frost-hardened ground. Somewhere deep in that darkness, a blind Mustang named Briar stumbled forward, guided by scent and instinct alone. The wind bit at his flanks, sharp as broken glass, but it wasn't the weather that hunted him, it was hunger, stalking him on 4 silent legs. The wolves had returned. There were 4 of them now, lean, calculating creatures of the high country. They were not the great noble beasts of storybooks, but survivors like Briar, sharpened by famine and cold. The leader, a grizzled gray male with a torn ear and an old scar slicing through his muzzle, was called Riven by the forest folk who once saw him and never forgot. Riven was ancient by wild standards, yet cunning beyond measure. His eyes, one clouded from age, burned with a cold patience as he watched Briar limp through the trees. The younger wolves flanked him. Yarrow, a slender black-coated female with a limp in her back leg from an old elk chase gone wrong, moved with a twitchy, nervous energy. She was always the first to strike and the first to retreat. Then there was Scree, the youngest, still growing into his oversized paws, his coat a bristling cinnamon shade, eager, reckless, but loyal to the pack's rhythm. The fourth, unnamed and ghost-like, stayed just out of reach, silent, shadowy, waiting. Briar had sensed them from the moment the wind shifted. His ears caught their shuffle, his nostrils flared with their scent, earth, blood, and old meat. He turned his head toward a sound he couldn't see, muscles coiled, breath short. His blind eyes stared through the dark like hollow glass, but his soul remained sharp. He broke into a trot, favoring his left leg. The pain along his ribs from the earlier fall throbbed with each breath. Snow crunched beneath him, loud and betraying. The forest narrowed. Pine trunks rose like pillars, sharp with icicles. The terrain was unfamiliar, and Briar's confidence thinned. The wolves fanned out, hurting him without a word. Briar veered right, only to be cut off by a growl. He turned again, another snarl. Then silence. That was the worst of all. Silence before the pounce. And then it came. Riven lunged first, a blur of gray muscle and teeth. Briar reared instinctively, hooves slashing air. A sharp yelp echoed contact. Riven dropped back, his muzzle bleeding. But the others surged forward. Yarrow darted in, raking claws across Briar's shoulder. Scree went low, nipping at his legs. Briar spun wildly, hooves swinging in arcs, striking nothing, striking everything. One blow landed hard. Scree tumbled with a surprised yip. But then Yarrow was on him again, and Briar felt a searing pain tear across his side. His legs buckled. He fell. The snow beneath him turned pink. Above, the trees swayed violently in the wind as if recoiling. Briar's chest heaved. Every breath was a stab of fire. Blood dripped from his flank, warm and slow. Then a sound cut through the madness. It was sharp, alien, metallic. A whistle, loud, piercing, human. The wolves froze. Briar's head lifted in shock. From the ridge above, a new figure descended, flanked by the howl of wind and the thrum of urgent footsteps. She moved quickly, her silhouette outlined by the glint of a flashlight beam bouncing through the snow. Her name was Sarah Whitlow, a wildlife biologist who had traded a promising East Coast academic life for the solitude of northern Arizona. At 32, she had the build of someone who knew how to endure. Tall, lean, with long arms always streaked in mud or scratches. Her thick hair was usually tied into a messy braid, now dusted with frost, and her features, sharp cheekbones, steady, hazel eyes, reflected a quiet kind of sorrow, the kind earned from losing more than she cared to admit. Sarah had lost her younger brother Isaac to a drowning accident 10 years ago. They'd both loved horses as kids, riding every summer at their grandfather's farm. Since his passing, she dedicated herself to animal rescue and ecological research, hoping to give purpose to a wound she couldn't close. Tonight, she'd been tracking a different herd when she heard the disturbance. Strange movement on her audio monitors, odd readings from her satellite tag network, and then the sounds. Wolves. A fight. Something was wrong. She fired a single flare into the sky, red light painting the trees like blood. The wolves scattered instantly, their shadows vanishing into the forest. Riven paused last, his gaze locked onto Briar, and then he too turned away, melting into the dark. Sarah slid down the slope, nearly falling as she reached the Mustang's side. She gasped softly. The horse was blind. The blood at his side was welling from a jagged claw mark, and the ice clinging to his legs suggested hours of wandering. He was large, even lying down, and his coat, though matted and dulled, held the ghost of something noble. Sarah knelt beside him and whispered, "Easy, boy. I'm not here to hurt you." Briar trembled, flinched at the sound, but did not flee. He was too weak. Sarah unzipped her field pack, drawing out antiseptic and bandages. She moved with calm precision, murmuring softly as she worked. She'd always believed animals could understand more than people gave them credit for. "I don't know what happened to you," she said as she cleaned the wound, "but you've been through hell, haven't you?" Briar let out a low snort, half pain, half acknowledgement. Overhead, the snow softened. The wind settled to a whisper. Sarah wrapped the injury as best she could, then stood and pulled out a collapsible tarp. She couldn't carry him, but she could guide him. She tied one end gently around Briar's neck and tugged slightly. "Come on, it's not far. There's shelter at my cabin." Briar didn't move at first, but then something deep within responded, not to the words but to the tone, the cadence of someone who cared. Slowly, shakily, he rose. Together, they moved. The moon broke through the clouds. The trees watched silently, and the forest, for the first time in days, held its breath. The night deepened into a bitter, howling symphony as the storm descended upon the San Francisco peaks. Snow and sleet fell in wild sheets, whipping through the conifers like daggers from the sky. Thunder rolled over the mountain ridges with such force that even the rocks seemed to tremble. Sarah Whitlow pulled her parka tighter as she led Briar along the narrow trail that cut across a rocky slope above a frozen ravine. The wind pushed sideways, nearly knocking her off balance. Briar followed behind, his blind eyes glazed with pain, his breath sharp and shallow. The blood had stopped flowing, but every step was an act of sheer will. His muscles screamed, but there was no safety in stopping. The scent of wolves still lingered in the wind, faint but fresh. Somewhere beyond the trees, they were regrouping. Sarah knew time was not on their side. Her cabin was still 2 miles away, nestled in a pine clearing below the ridge, and the only shelter between them and whatever else the storm planned to hurl at them. She glanced back at the Mustang, who trudged after her, ribs showing beneath his damp coat, legs coated in crusted blood and slush. He didn't hesitate, didn't complain. He just followed. And that, after everything, moved her more than she could say. As they rounded a bend in the trail, lightning split the sky, revealing a pale figure sitting under a rock ledge just ahead. Sarah tensed and signaled for Briar to stop. The figure stood slowly. It was a dog, an old one by the look of it. Its fur was shaggy and dull, once golden but now faded by age and weather. One ear stood erect while the other drooped. It didn't bark or growl, just watched with calm, unblinking eyes. When Sarah stepped forward cautiously, the dog simply wagged its tail once and sat down again, as if to say, "I've been waiting." The dog wore a cracked leather collar with a rusted brass tag that read, Milo. Milo had once belonged to a forest ranger who had passed away the year prior in an avalanche accident. The dog had refused to leave the area, surviving on scraps, snowmelt, and his own wits. Locals had spotted him now and then, but no one had managed to catch him. He was a legend in these parts, a ghost dog of the peaks. But now, under this ledge in the middle of a storm, he looked more like a forgotten soldier who'd finally found someone worth trusting again. Sarah approached him slowly, hand outstretched. Milo sniffed, then licked her glove. She smiled. "You want to come with us?" He rose and fell in step beside Briar without hesitation, occasionally glancing up at the Mustang as if recognizing pain in a different form. They descended into a shallow valley where snow had begun to gather in thick drifts. Sarah's flashlight beam flickered and died. The wind stole her breath. Briar stumbled once, dropping to a knee, "Sir's dead," and Sarah rushed to his side, laying a hand on his neck. He shivered under her touch but did not retreat. Just then, another crack of thunder erupted overhead, followed by a flash of light so blinding it painted the trees bone white. The ground shook. Snow and debris fell from the cliffs above, crashing into the ravine behind them. And then they heard it. Hoofbeats. Far off, faint, echoing. Briar's ears shot up. He lifted his head, nostrils flaring, his whole body stilled. Sarah froze too. "What is it?" He let out a soft sound, half whimper, half call. Another rumble. The hoofbeats again. Were they real? Sarah heard nothing but wind and trees groaning, but Briar stepped forward, almost pulling her with him. Something had stirred in him, something old and sacred. She didn't question. She followed. They made their way down a deer trail that wound along a semi-frozen stream. The water had grown fierce with runoff, churning through icy channels, swollen from the storm. Briar reached the edge and stopped. The current was loud, angry. Snowflakes danced on its surface before vanishing into the cold rush. Briar sniffed the air. The hoofbeats had faded, but his ears turned eastward, as if something still called him. He stepped into the stream. Sarah shouted, tried to stop him, but it was too late. The current caught his legs immediately. Milo barked from behind. Briar flailed for footing as the river swept him sideways. Panic flashed across his face. Blind, he couldn't see where the rocks were. A jagged stone scraped his leg, and he let out a pained cry. The water dragged him further, threatening to pull him under completely. Sarah tossed her pack and ran downstream. She knew these creeks. She'd mapped them herself. A bend was coming, a calmer pool where the current broke. If he could just make it there? She cut through the trees, lungs burning, and saw him. A shadow tossed among waves, his legs flailing weakly. He was moments from drowning. Without thinking, she waded in. The water was ice. It punched the air from her chest. But she reached Briar, grabbed hold of his mane, and pulled him toward the shore with every bit of strength left in her body. Milo barked wildly from the bank. Together, woman and horse collapsed on the muddy shoreline, soaked and shivering. Briar coughed water from his lungs. Sarah lay beside him, breathless, heart hammering. Snow landed on her cheeks like feathers. Milo licked her face once, then curled beside them both. Minutes passed. Eventually, Sarah sat up and looked at Briar. "You're insane, you know that?" Briar snorted softly. She smiled, then leaned back again and looked up at the sky. The storm was beginning to pass. The clouds thinned and stars peeked through in cautious clusters. Somewhere out there, perhaps, a herd was running beneath the same sky. But for now, in this clearing on the edge of the storm, 3 souls had survived something fierce together, and that was enough. By the time the storm had finally limped away to the east, the forest glistened with frost and silence. The moon, full and indifferent, hung above the snow-laden pines like a silent witness. Sarah Whitlow walked beside Briar, the blind Mustang who had become her unlikely companion, while Milo trotted ahead, his aging limbs somehow lightened by purpose. They followed no trail, only Briar's instincts, something Sarah had learned to trust more than maps. It had been 2 days since the river tried to claim him. Since then, Briar had changed. He was more alert, ears constantly turning, head often tilted toward sounds Sarah couldn't hear. Something in him was pulling, calling, and tonight, he stopped at the crest of a shallow rise and raised his head, sniffing the wind with such intensity it stole her breath. "Do you hear something?" she whispered, though she knew he would not answer. His stillness was answer enough. Briar stepped forward. The slope beyond was wide and open, a clearing kissed with moonlight. Snow had melted into patches of damp earth. In the distance, clustered beneath a few twisted junipers, stood a herd of wild horses, no more than a dozen. Their coats gleamed silver in the light, steam rising from their flanks as they breathed. Some grazed, others stood on watch. Briar froze. Sarah placed a hand lightly on his shoulder. "Is it them?" she murmured. He didn't move, but his body trembled beneath her fingers. Then he walked. Each step was tentative, deliberate. His head was lowered slightly, not in submission, but in reverence, like one approaching something sacred. Sarah didn't follow. She stayed behind with Milo, letting him have this moment alone. As Briar drew closer, the horses began to take notice. A few lifted their heads. One young filly snorted and stamped. A tall dun gelding stepped in front of the group protectively. His stance was rigid, wary. Then she emerged. From behind the gelding stepped a mare, strong, sleek, her coat the color of moon-kissed slate. Her mane, long and black, moved slightly with the breeze. Her name was Sable. Briar stopped where the moonlight ended and shadow began. Though he could not see her, he knew her. Sable, his sister. She had been the steady one, the brave one. They had grown up side by side, shared storms and rivers and sunlit summers in the valley. Her whinny was like home. He let out a low, almost questioning call. Sable stared at him. For a moment, the whole herd stilled. Sable stepped forward, scenting the wind. She blinked, her nostrils flaring, and then she saw. His eyes clouded, pale. His coat ragged, torn. The scar down his ribs still angry from the wolves. She recoiled. Briar froze. The gelding behind her stepped closer. Another mare joined him, her ears pinned back. A chorus of suspicion rippled through the group. They circled Sable protectively, watching Briar as if he were an intruder. A threat. Something other. He took another step. Sable snorted sharply and turned her head. She didn't call his name. She didn't move forward. She didn't recognize him, or worse, she did, and still turned away. Briar's ears drooped. His head lowered. The herd shifted, closing ranks. The young ones moved behind the adults. No one advanced. No one welcomed. Sarah had seen enough. She approached slowly, heart aching as she watched the Mustang shrink into himself. He looked smaller somehow, as though the distance between him and the herd was not measured in feet, but in lifetimes. Milo followed behind, tail lowered, ears half-mast. Sarah knelt beside Briar and placed a hand over his heart. "Come on," she whispered. "Let's go." He did not move. Then, with agonizing slowness, Briar turned his back to the only family he had ever known. They didn't stop him. They didn't call out. And when he disappeared back into the tree line, the herd returned to grazing as if he had never been there. Back at their makeshift camp under the shelter of a fallen pine, Sarah built a small fire. Milo curled beside her, head resting on her boots. Briar stood nearby, not lying down, not eating, just standing, silent as a statue, ears slack. Sarah pulled out a tin of oats and placed it near him, but he didn't touch it. She didn't speak. She just sat, watching the fire flicker. It was nearly midnight when she heard the sound, a soft whinny. Not from Briar, but from deeper in the woods. She looked up sharply. Briar lifted his head too, ears flicking, and then from the shadows emerged a single horse. She was small, piebald, no more than 3 years old. Her coloring was unusual, dark red with white markings around her eyes that gave her a perpetually startled expression. Her mane was tangled and she limped slightly on her left leg. But there was intelligence in her gaze. Her name, Sarah would later learn, was Hazel, a young outcast driven away from the same herd that rejected Briar. She had always been different, curious, quiet, drawn more to the edges than the center. When she saw Briar earlier that night, she had waited until the others fell asleep before following the path he left behind. Hazel stepped cautiously into the firelight, eyes never leaving Briar. He turned toward her slowly, tilting his head as if listening for something only he could hear. She let out a small sound. He answered, soft and low. And just like that, something shifted. Briar took one step forward. Hazel didn't move. Then another, and another, until they stood nose to nose. Sarah watched in silence as Hazel nudged gently at Briar's cheek, and he in turn touched her shoulder with his muzzle. No dramatic reunion, no galloping embrace, just two souls, lost in different ways, finding each other in the quiet aftermath of pain. Sarah leaned back against the pine and closed her eyes. It wasn't the family Briar had sought, but maybe it was the one he was meant to find. The next morning broke pale and brittle over the rim of the forest, brushing the frostbitten trees in silver. Mist lingered in the underbrush, curling around the sleeping forms nestled under the charred remains of the campfire. Briar stood just beyond the ashes, unmoving but not asleep. His blind eyes focused toward the edge of the clearing as if sensing something beyond. Hazel rested nearby, her small body curled in the dry grass, dozing peacefully, while Milo kept watch at the perimeter, his old eyes sharper than one would guess from his grizzled face. Sarah, wrapped in her sleeping bag and fleece jacket, stirred awake with a grunt. Her joints ached from the hard ground, but she was used to discomfort. Years of wilderness work had taught her to sleep anywhere. Still, something was off. The scent of smoke, not hers. It came from deeper eastward, beyond the pines, carried on the wind with a strange sweetness. Not the sharpness of burning wood alone, but something herbal. Wild mint, maybe? She stood, brushed her hands down her cargo pants, and grabbed her pack. Milo had already risen and was staring into the trees. Hazel flicked her ears. Briar stood taller. Sarah squinted, the hair on her arms lifting. And then, from between the trees, a figure emerged. He was tall and broad, wrapped in a heavy oilskin coat patched with canvas and old denim. A scarf was tied loosely around his neck, stained by smoke and time, and his boots sank into the earth with the slow certainty of someone who did not fear the wilderness. His beard was long, streaked with silver, and his thick, sun-worn hands held a tin canteen. His eyes were startling, not wild, but deeply quiet, like water that runs slow because it's deep. This was Elias Monroe, 56 years old, a recluse who lived alone in the wild pine field, a remote stretch of land at the edge of Coconino Forest. No one in town had seen Elias in nearly a year. Whispers about him varied. Some said he'd been a teacher, others that he'd fought fires in Oregon and lost a son to the flames. The truth was quieter and more complicated. He had once been a carpenter, a good one, with a house and a marriage in Flagstaff. But grief had hollowed him after his wife's cancer diagnosis, and her death had pushed him off the grid. He hadn't hated the world, but he no longer wished to live inside it. Now he lived with the forest, and today, the forest had sent him something unusual. He stopped a few feet from Sarah, and though she gripped the handle of her field knife instinctively, he raised both hands calmly. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said, his voice gravely and soft, like old wood bending in wind. "Smelled the fire. Figured someone else was alive out here." Sarah slowly released the blade. "Not many of us left walking." Elias nodded, then glanced at Briar. The Mustang had stepped forward slightly, his body tense but not afraid. His ears twitched toward the stranger. Elias noticed the scars, the clouded eyes. "Poor boy's blind," he murmured, more to himself than anyone. Sarah crossed her arms, and smarter than half the people I've worked with. Elias gave a soft chuckle. "Looks like he's still got plenty of fight." He knelt slowly and placed the canteen in the snow. Then, without asking, pulled a dried pine branch from his pack, snapped it, and began stacking a small fire. Sarah watched as he worked, methodical but gentle, never wasting a movement. The fire sparked under his flint and steel. Milo crept closer and sniffed him, then settled beside him, tail wagging faintly. "You make friends quick," Sarah muttered, crouching beside him. "Old dogs don't judge much," Elias replied, feeding the flame. "And neither do horses, usually." After the fire caught, he poured water into a steel bowl and slid it toward Briar. The Mustang sniffed it, then took a tentative sip. Hazel watched from behind Sarah's shoulder, her wide, anxious eyes fixed on the stranger. "She yours?" Elias asked. "No," Sarah said, looking toward Hazel. "She found him, after his own herd left him behind." Elias didn't speak for a moment. Then he said, "Sometimes the strays understand us better than blood ever will." They sat in silence, the fire popping softly. Birds stirred in the branches overhead, and the wind had calmed. Elias didn't ask many questions. Neither did Sarah. That's what she liked about him immediately. He didn't fill silence with noise, just let it settle like snow. Eventually she spoke. "You live nearby?" "Out past Wild Pine Ridge. Few hours' walk." "Alone?" He nodded. "You always help strangers in the woods?" He smiled faintly. "Only the ones that aren't trying to shoot me." Sarah let out a short laugh. As the sun rose, Elias helped them break camp. He offered a bundle of dried grass and pine needles soaked in lavender and ash bark. "For the horse's wounds," he said. Sarah watched as he applied it gently to Briar's scarred flank, whispering something under his breath. It wasn't prayer, just kindness. Before they parted ways, Elias knelt beside Briar and placed a hand on the Mustang's chest. "You're still here," he said softly. "That means something." Briar didn't move, but something about his stillness seemed changed, as if that touch had pressed a message deeper than words could carry. Elias stood, packed his satchel, and looked at Sarah. "If you head east tomorrow, the ground will be easier, but there's a storm coming the day after. Watch the river. It swells fast when it's angry." Sarah nodded. "Thanks." He began to walk away, but paused, glancing back once. "When the wild has nothing left to give, it usually sends you someone," he said. "Or something." And then he was gone, swallowed by the trees. Sarah stared after him for a long time. Milo lay down again. Briar turned his head slowly toward the path Elias had taken and gave a single, short whinny. Hazel stepped closer to him. In the stillness that followed, a truth settled like snow. They were no longer alone, not in pain, not in memory, and not in the journey ahead. The land stretched northward like a puzzle of stone and silence, carved by wind and time into something both breathtaking and brutal. Northern Arizona in late March was a contradiction. Sun-kissed plateaus by day and biting winds by night. The snow lingered in shaded crevices, while dry grass clawed up through thawing soil in others. In this rugged expanse, where maps meant little and trails faded fast, 4 unlikely companions pressed onward. A blind Mustang, a woman with grief worn deep, a forgotten dog of the forest, and now, a stranger with a past full of shadows. Elias Monroe walked at the front, tall and weathered, using a hand-carved walking stick of juniper wood to test each slope and ravine. His long stride never wavered, even when the terrain shifted beneath him. His coat, patched and stained from years of travel, flapped like a tired flag in the wind. He didn't speak often, and when he did, it was only to point out a turn in the rocks or a soft patch of ice up ahead. His silence wasn't cold, it was purposeful. Sarah had grown to recognize it as a kind of reverence for the land, the way someone might lower their voice in a church. Sarah Whitlow followed just behind him, her steps precise and calculated. Tall and wiry, her frame seemed to adapt to any landscape, from swamp to cliff. She had tied her long hair up into a tighter braid than usual, and her eyes were red-rimmed from a mix of wind and memory. She had not spoken of Elias's presence since they met, and neither had she asked why he had joined them. Some bonds don't need definitions. They simply happen. Briar moved slowly between Sarah and Elias, relying less on Sarah's gentle voice now and more on his own sharpened senses. His ears, once just tools for sound, had become his guides. Every snap of a twig, every shift of wind was a breadcrumb. His nose stayed high, catching the stories the earth whispered. Herds that had passed, rivers that roared ahead, danger waiting in the shadows. The storm had not broken him, rejection had not ended him. But this quiet in-between place, where the past could not reach and the future had not arrived, this was where he struggled. Hazel trotted beside him, her gait still carrying a slight limp. The younger mare had become his silent tether. She did not push him or pity him. She simply walked where he walked, ate when he ate, and slept when he slept. When he froze, she stood still. When he moved again, she followed. It was not devotion. It was something older, deeper. Kinship without question. Milo, the aging golden mutt with one drooping ear, scouted ahead. He had taken on the role of guardian with quiet dignity, sniffing out tracks, pausing to bark at cliff sides when he sensed snakes or mountain cats nearby. He never strayed far, always circling back to ensure the others followed. On the 4th night, the wind turned cruel. Sleet began to fall just after dusk, slicing sideways through the forest like glass. The group had been moving along a shallow ravine, hoping to find shelter before nightfall. But the slopes were too steep, and the trees too thin to break the storm's wrath. Elias halted and looked up at the sky, his eyes squinting beneath a furrowed brow. He scanned the cliffs. "There's a half cave about 20 minutes northeast," he said, shouting above the storm. "I used it once. It's tight, but it'll hold us." Sarah nodded, already pulling her scarf higher. Briar, sensing the urgency, pushed forward with more effort than before. His muscles screamed, but he did not stop. The sound of sleet hitting rock, the echo of thunder somewhere far off, it all blended into a deafening silence in his mind. A silence he hated. With great effort, they reached the cave. It was shallow, no more than a carved-out cleft in the rock, but it was dry and shielded from the worst of the wind. Elias lit a small fire near the back, his hands moving swiftly despite the cold. Sarah unrolled a tarp and laid it across the ground for Briar and Hazel. Milo curled up against the windbreak, his body shivering but eyes still alert. That night, as the storm raged outside, Briar stood near the entrance, his body soaked and trembling. Hazel lay behind him, half asleep. Sarah slept against her pack, exhaustion finally overtaking her. Elias sat on a flat stone beside the fire, slowly mending a torn strap on his satchel. Then he noticed Briar wasn't resting. He rose, walked quietly toward him, and placed one large, calloused hand on the horse's shoulder. Briar flinched at first, but didn't retreat. Elias leaned closer and whispered, "You think I'll leave too, don't you?" Briar didn't move. Elias kept his hand steady. "I've seen that doubt before, in myself." The wind outside howled like something wounded. He took off his coat and draped it gently across Briar's back, shielding the Mustang from the chill seeping through the rock. "We'll get through this," he murmured. "All of us." For a long time, neither man nor horse moved. And then, slowly, Briar lowered his head and leaned just slightly into Elias's side. The cave held no heat, but for the small fire and their shared breath, yet it felt, for the first time in days, like shelter. In the morning, the sleet was gone, replaced by an eerie calm. The land glistened like crystal, every branch adorned with a layer of glass. It was beautiful, fragile, a reminder that even in nature's wrath, grace could be found. They continued north. No path guided them now. Just instinct, trust, and a hope not yet named. By mid-April, spring had begun to paint the northern Arizona wilderness in strokes of renewal. The air smelled of wet pine and warm soil, and the valleys, once blanketed in snow, now pulsed with life. Wildflowers unfurled like painted stars across the open meadows, their petals trembling in the soft wind. But the land had not shed its harshness entirely. Sudden storms still gathered over the San Francisco peaks, and the terrain remained as unforgiving as ever. Briar moved more steadily now. Though his eyes remained clouded, the rest of him had begun to recover, the strength in his legs returning, his wounds scabbing into scars. His coat, once dulled and matted, had grown shinier from Elias's herb salves and Hazel's constant grooming. Sarah often noticed how the younger mare nuzzled the old Mustang without expectation. There was no hierarchy between them, no contest. They were simply two broken pieces of something once whole, now carrying each other. They had been moving eastward for several days, following no clear trail. Elias led by instinct, Sarah by compass, and Briar by something far older, memory. That morning, they descended into a low valley ringed by cottonwoods and painted with wild lupine. Birds chattered above, and for once the air carried no threat. Then Briar stopped. His ears twitched forward, nostrils wide. Milo, who had been scouting ahead, froze and looked back, tail half raised. Hazel halted beside Briar, neck arched. Elias narrowed his eyes. "What is it?" Sarah asked quietly, stepping beside him. Briar lowered his head and sniffed the ground, then took a step forward. Another, and then another. Elias followed, inspecting the ground. Tracks, faint but fresh. Hoofprints, unshod, deep. A small herd, maybe 4 or 5. One lighter than the others, possibly a yearling. Sarah crouched to examine them more closely. "These are less than 12 hours old," she said. "And heading north-northeast." Briar let out a soft breath, almost a sigh, and took off at a brisk trot. "Wait, Briar," Sarah called, but he didn't stop. Hazel shot forward after him, and Milo barked in response. Elias just nodded, already gathering his pack. "Let him lead," he said. "He knows what he's doing." For the next few hours, they followed the trail across rolling hills and dry stream beds, through pockets of sage and yellow wild mustard. The tracks remained clear despite the shifting terrain. Something in Briar had changed. His steps carried an urgency Sarah hadn't seen in him since the night he heard the distant whinny. There was hope in the way he moved, or maybe longing. By mid-afternoon, clouds began to gather. Thick, dark clouds with blue-green veins that curled like bruises across the sky. Elias glanced upward. "That's not just spring rain," he said. "It's going to hit hard. We need shelter," Sarah said, already scanning the land. But Briar didn't slow. The wind picked up, bringing with it the scent of ozone and damp soil. Lightning flashed behind them, and thunder boomed moments later. Hazel neighed nervously but stuck close to Briar. Milo lagged a little, his old legs not made for bursts of speed anymore. Then the first wave of hail fell, sharp and sudden, stinging like thrown pebbles. Sarah pulled her jacket over her head and shouted through the wind, "Briar, stop! We have to take cover!" But the Mustang kept moving, even as the ground turned slick. His breath came in gasps, his legs sliding beneath him on muddy stone, yet he pressed forward. He was chasing something just out of reach. Suddenly, he stumbled. His front legs folded and he collapsed onto his knees. Hazel whinnied and darted back to his side. Sarah and Elias caught up seconds later, breathless. Briar lay panting, ribs heaving, his coat soaked through. Sarah knelt beside him, placing her hand over his chest. "He's exhausted." Elias crouched down and ran his hands over the Mustang's legs. "Nothing broken, just overpushed. He's been burning through his reserves too fast." Then it happened. From somewhere deep ahead, beyond a ridge that curved like a broken spine, they heard it. A whinny. Faint, distant, but real. Briar's head shot up, his ears twisted. Hazel pawed the ground, anxious. The sound came again, clearer this time, higher in pitch. Young. Sarah met Elias's eyes. "There's a yearling up there. Part of the herd? Maybe?" Before they could decide, Briar surged to his feet. He staggered but remained standing. Elias rose beside him and reached for the rope gently knotted around Briar's halter. He gave a soft tug. "I've got you," he whispered. Together, they climbed the final ridge. The storm still raged behind them, but ahead the sky was clearing, just barely. A crack of gold near the horizon. At the top of the rise, they found the source of the call. A narrow plateau stretched ahead, dotted with cedar and juniper. But it was empty. The herd was gone. Only flattened grass remained, along with a few hoofprints disappearing into the next valley. The whinny had stopped. Briar walked to the center of the field and stood still. He sniffed, listened. Silence. Sarah placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. "He thought they were here." "They were," Elias said. "Just not anymore." Briar let out a soft, mournful sound. Not pain, not frustration, just release. He didn't collapse this time. He didn't cry out. He simply turned around and began walking back toward the others. Sarah watched him in quiet awe. He's learning that sometimes surviving means letting go. Elias nodded, or choosing to keep walking even after the trail runs cold. Hazel trotted forward and brushed against Briar's side. Milo, soaked and limping slightly, circled around and sat near Sarah. They camped on the ridge that night. The storm moved on. The sky cleared to reveal 1,000 stars, each one sharp and bright, like fragments of an old story still trying to be told. Years passed with the quiet certainty of a river carving stone, steady, invisible, yet undeniable. The wilds of Flagstaff, once sharp with storm and shadow, softened in the warmth of memory. The winds still howled through the Coconino forest, but their voices had changed. They no longer whispered warnings. Now they sang of what had been built here. Not in wood or stone, but in resilience, trust, and the sacred weight of companionship. Briar, once a young, blind stallion scarred by wolves and abandoned by blood, had become something else entirely. His once chestnut coat now bore streaks of silver, especially along his muzzle and spine, catching the moonlight like frost on bark. The deep scars down his side remained visible, though time had softened them. He moved more slowly now, with the gentle grace of someone who no longer needed to prove he belonged in this world. His sight had never returned, but his senses had grown into something almost mythic. Locals who glimpsed him from afar swore he could read the wind, navigate storms, and even calm frightened animals with nothing but his presence. He had become a legend, not because he fought harder than others, but because he survived with dignity and chose, again and again, to stay open to love. Elias Monroe still walked beside him. Now nearly 60, Elias had let the wilderness wear its truth into his body. His once dark beard was almost entirely white, his skin weathered like tanned hide. But his hands were steady, and his gait strong. His heavy coat had been replaced with a lighter canvas wrap stitched from hides and thread given by local ranchers and hikers who came to know his quiet generosity. He spoke more now, not with words, but with presence. Those who passed through Wild Pine Field often found small caches of food, clean water, or repaired fences, never knowing who had left them. He and Sarah had built a small post and beam shelter in a valley east of Elk Knob, a halfway point between isolation and civilization. Sarah had returned to Flagstaff only briefly to testify in a case involving protected herds, and had chosen not to stay. The noise, the concrete, the artificial light, it no longer made sense to her. She still hiked in and out to bring supplies, her frame leaner now, her face clearer. The grief she once wore as armor had become a quiet strength she shared in gentle touches and long silences. Hazel had grown into a sleek, strong mare. Her red and white coat remained as striking as ever, and though her left leg still bore a slight limp, it never slowed her down. She became Briar's second shadow, never straying far, especially when new horses appeared at the edge of their territory. Always alone, always lost. It was Hazel who would approach first, nudge them gently and lead them to Briar, because Briar had become a beacon. Over the years, other horses found him, some injured, some rejected, others simply wandering with no herd to call home. A pinto mare named Marrow, once rescued from a barbed wire fence, Tuck, a gelding who had escaped a ranch fire and bore half a burned ear, and Lumen, a skittish Appaloosa foal who had never known a family until now. They didn't follow him like a leader. They surrounded him like a campfire. Warmth, safety, a place to rest. One spring morning, as the snow melted into brilliant streams and buttercups bloomed in every hollow, Briar stood atop a hill overlooking a stretch of prairie thick with purple verbena and golden paintbrush. Below him, the new herd grazed peacefully, Hazel dozing under the shade of a sycamore, Lumen chasing butterflies, Tuck and Marrow standing flank to flank in a quiet ritual of shared space. Elias approached from behind, holding a walking stick carved with symbols. He stood beside Briar, resting one hand on the stallion's shoulder. The wind lifted his silver hair as he looked out across the meadow. "They're home," he said softly. Briar didn't reply. He simply lowered his head and exhaled, a breath that felt ancient, rooted, complete. Later that evening, as the sun began its descent, the sky ignited into fire. Gold bled into rose, then deepened into crimson until the whole world looked dipped in flame. Elias lit a small fire near the center of the valley. The horses gathered around at a respectful distance. Milo, now old and deaf, lay curled at the fire's edge. His fur had faded almost white, and his legs barely carried him anymore. Yet he refused to be left behind. He had been with Briar from the first storm, and he would remain until the last. As twilight deepened, Briar stepped away from the fire. He walked alone to the crest of the hill once more and stood there, facing the fading horizon. The wind toyed with his mane. Hazel followed but did not crowd him. She knew. He lowered himself to the ground and didn't rise again. No drama, no sound, just a slow breath that became stillness. Elias came to his side, knelt, and pressed his hand gently to Briar's shoulder. "Thank you," he whispered, "for staying." The stars came out, one by one. The wind curled through the grass like an old lullaby. The herd gathered around, not with panic or mourning, but with stillness. They knew. And so the blind Mustang who had once been left for dead beneath the pines died not in loneliness, but in legacy. He left behind no bloodline, no name carved into stone, but he left something stronger. A herd formed not by birth, but by choice. Not led by dominance, but by presence. Not forged by power, but by shared pain and earned peace. In the years that followed, hikers spoke of a white-flecked Mustang seen under the stars, always standing near the edge of a field glowing with wildflowers. They said he never ran, only watched, as if waiting for one more wanderer to arrive. Some said it was just legend. But those who had known him, Sarah, Elias, Hazel, and even the quiet, loyal Milo, knew the truth. Some stories don't end, they just change form. Love, after all, is never buried. It becomes the soil from which something braver can grow. In the silence of the wild, where no roads are marked and no voices answer back, a blind Mustang taught us something most of us forget. Miracles don't always come with thunder or light. Sometimes, they arrive quietly, in the form of a friend who stays, a stranger who heals, or a second chance when all seems lost. Briar's journey reminds us that even in blindness, even when the world turns away, God is still guiding us, through instincts, through kindness, and through the people and creatures he places in our path. Just like Briar found his way not by sight, but by trust, so too can we walk through darkness with faith. You might not see the miracle yet, but it's coming. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below with the word Amen to declare your faith in God's timing and His plan for your life. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and pray that the Lord blesses every viewer who hears this story. Miracles are real. They just don't always look the way we expect. May God bless you and guide your steps, just like He did for Briar.